everyone, and welcome to the second annual My Sister's Keepers Week. MSK Week is focused on young Black women making their health a priority. My name is Bria Johnson, and I'm the Reproductive Justice Coordinator for the My Sister's Keeper program here at the Black Women's Health Imperative. This evening's panel, Exploring Sexual Pleasure, will focus on unlearning negative thoughts and judgments about your body and self, exploring pleasure for survivors, and other topics from a sex positive lens. So let's get started. And I'm so happy to introduce our phenomenal panelists. So, first up, we have Sierra Ross, who is a guest lecturer at Columbia. Sierra is a researcher, writer, and communications professional currently based in Brooklyn, New York. Rooted in Black feminist praxis, Sierra builds strategy, data, and curriculums for supporting Black, queer, and trans survivors of violence. Her leadership at institutions such as Spelman College and New York City's Anti-Violence Project has increased community access to critical resources and opportunities in pivotal times of survival. Sierra is also an artist working to preserve the tradition of honoring Black interior life through memory and ancestral reverence. Hi, Sierra. Next up, we have Harmony Phoenix, a practicing abolitionist and spiritualist. Harmony Phoenix is a Black queer ratchet practicing abolitionist in the South. They carry the titles of parent, spiritualist, and space creator. HP's assignments and work in this life led them to being a person who helps people reconnect to their ancestral technologies as a means of resistance and transformation. They believe healing ourselves and centering joy are the first steps to reimagining a world free from oppression, and it's Harmony Phoenix's direct honor to be called to serve their community in this capacity. Hi, Harmony Phoenix. Next up, we have Rosa, who is a public health researcher. Rosa has a particular interest in reproductive and sexual health research, as well as working to improve the lives and health of girls and women. Rosa has a degree in biomedical sciences and a MS in sexual reproductive health research. Her areas of research include evaluations of the PEPFAR and Gates-funded Dreams Interventions Program, an analysis of Canada's Her Future, Her Choice intervention program, and the evolution of the World's Vision's Adolescent Girls, and the Young Women's AIDS-Free Project. She is currently a migration health assistant, but has other passions such as baking. And then lastly, hi Rosa. Lastly, we have Kat. Kat is an anthropologist, sociologist, student, writer, artist, activist, and advocate for survivors. Kat is a current student who is working towards her master's in anthropology. One of Kat's focuses with anthropology is to conduct research for sex workers, survivors, victims across different cultures. Whew, okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm excited to be here with you all tonight to talk about pleasure, but specifically like Black pleasure for Black survivors, and just pleasure through a sex positive lens. Just to give you some context, this event kind of came out of thought about like always talking about Blackness in a negative context or what's wrong in the world. And we wanted to kind of finally have an event that's like, what is our pleasure, right? And just think about that. And what is our relationship to our bodies in a more lens? Ooh, I hear feedback on my camera. I don't know what's going on. Do y'all hear that? Hold on one second.
I did.
Yeah, slightly.
Okay. We're gonna try this again. So first up, the first question I have is for Sierra, and we're just gonna jump right into it. What is finding pleasure like for survivors of sexual violence?
Hi. So happy to be here, and thank you for having me. I love this question, and I think that to begin, I can say I'm not qualified to answer for all survivors, right? Because it looks so different for each survivor, how pleasure will show up for them and how they'll be able to navigate that, because we have different positionalities. We all occupy different power and different, frames of what we are terming privilege at this point. And so it's going to look very different for different folks. But, I think that what I do want to start with, which, we are going to get away from doom and gloom as much as we can, but we do have to really situate ourselves in the facts of the matter of what survivors know is that pleasure is not apolitical, it's not a neutral zone. It's a space where violence has thrived, right? And we have also seen how pleasure and violence have coexisted because there's a story in our bodies about someone, some people, some organization deriving pleasure from our pain, right? And so navigating that and being able to say like, well, what does pleasure look like? It does start with the question of like, how can I trust the zone of pleasure again? How do I get back into the space where I can take up that self-possession and self-determination and say like, okay, this is something that I can have. This is something that I can own. And I think that question alone begins that process of healing and begins that process of saying like, this is a possibility for me. And it can be something that does not necessarily come out of these economies of sexual violence that we're seeing right now with like Roe versus Wade and all the things that we're seeing with the rollbacks of trans and queer human rights that people feel like they're granting us, right? And so I think that the question and the inquiry opens the door, and I'm always really interested in something that generates that line of thinking that says, this is mine, this body is mine, this pleasure is mine. I can determine what that looks like outside of these very, very limited confines of violence.
And so with keeping that in mind, like this body is mine, what do you think the Black women specifically need to know about pleasure to get to a place where they're talking and thinking like that?
Oh, I love that. What do we need to know about pleasure? So starting with knowing that it's yours to determine, and then also understanding the decision-making power that you actually do have over yourself, because assault often communicates to us that our bodies are not in our control, and that we don't have any capacity to make decisions for ourselves. Because we have that with us, we have to, there's a kind of a collective response that we have to have as survivors to say, actually, there is a lot of space for me to determine what I'm going to do with my body and what I'm going to do with my pleasure. So I think really, really honing in on that, because that's not the message we get from the world. That's not the message we get from our experiences. So having, the conversations like we're having right now with each other and looking at each other and saying, we can create the safety for you to make that decision. Knowing that it is not just a pain or a pleasure for you to hold alone, knowing that it's not an isolated event is really important. And so I'm sitting next to these books and I'm going to bring in one way that I feel like it's really important. One thing that really brought me back to myself after experiencing an assault is one quick stanza from Alice Walker that I really love in Her Blue Body, Everything We Know. That I think really hones in on the self-determination piece of saying like, okay, what do I need to know about pleasure? And this is really important to me. So this is from On Stripping Bark from Myself by Alice Walker. I'm just going to do 2 stanzas. It's not the whole thing. Because women are expected to keep silent about their close escapes, I will not keep silent. And if I am destroyed, naked tree, someone will please mark the spot where I fall and know I could not live silent in my own lies. Hearing their, how nice is she? Whose adoration of the retouched image I so despise. No, I am finished with living for what my mother believes, for what my brother and father defend, for what my lover elevates, for what my sister, blushing, denies or rushes to embrace. And so I think that really kind of honed in on, I need to own my no. I need to own my yes. And I have to figure out what that no and that yes is. Even though it's been like dispossessed from me, I can take that back.
I love that. I when I think about pleasure, I think sometimes it's for some people it comes after that point of refusal. Like I'm refusing something for the sake of my own pleasure. And I think that's such an important moment that you have, especially for survivors, like that point of refusal.
Oh, did we lose Bria? One moment.
Well,
Okay.
Really?
Yes, you're back.
you back. You back.
Today, my internet just played with me.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay. The next question that I have on that same kind of theme of pleasure, I want to jump to Harmony Phoenix and talk about what does finding pleasure mean outside of the gender binary, and like specifically how does the gender binary like limit us and our pleasure?
So first of all, I love this question. Thank you for asking it. And I had to write down what I wanted to say because I have a lot to say about this. But as I am a non-binary person, so I'm speaking. My answer is coming from personal experience and also just like my work with other gender expansive people. And my first thought is that the way that we're taught about pleasure from growing up is always through a cis hetero lens that centers cis het men. And that's why we have everybody other than cis het men not orgasming every time they have sex, right? And we're actually taught that sex doesn't start until penetration and doesn't end until the cis het man ejaculates. And that in itself limits us because it teaches us that pleasure is only for the cis het man, and they're not the only people having sex, obviously. So understanding that there are different gender identities and different gender expressions, as many of those as there are people, then we can also understand that sexual pleasure is not some blanket understanding, and it varies from person to person. Unlearning the gender binary gives space and freedom of expression and exploration. Like I joke all the time and I say that like I actually never had sex until I started having queer sex because it's
That's true.
it's different.
Yeah.
And it isn't because it wasn't just about the person that was having sex with me, and I say that intentionally, but it was about everyone involved in their pleasure. And there is an intentionality that comes with learning people and their bodies when you don't assign gender to them. It's new, it's care forward, it's curious versus thinking that because you watch porn or heard other cishet people talk about sex, then you know what you're doing. An example that I have is like DJ Envy, who is like a radio personality. His wife just came out and said that like she wasn't orgasming for like I love you. Can you go on your room real quick? Can I say that? Yes. Yay. Okay, go ahead. I'm answering the question. Sorry, y'all. Parenting in real time. DJ Envy's wife was like, I wasn't having an orgasm for like 10 years. And DJ Envy was like, well, I thought I was tearing it up. Huh? So, because like cishet men just think that they are doing whatever they're doing, and the people that they are having sex with are just taught that, you know, our pleasure comes from theirs. And that's actually not how that works. And to most people, sex is an idea and not a curious learning experience. And when you think about gender in that way, it lends its way. If you think about gender in an expansive way, it lends itself to start thinking about sex and sexual pleasure also in that way of it as expansive and for everybody that's involved.
I love that. I forgot to announce this, but we have some giveaways tonight. We're going to be giving away vibrator necklaces from Crave. And so what we would love is for folks who have joined us tonight to answer the question, what does sexual pleasure mean to you? And we'll let you know at the end who our four selected winners are. So I forgot to announce that. But now we're going to jump to Rosa. And I want to know, in your research, what have you found to be big misconceptions about pleasure, sexual pleasure?
Ooh, fun. Okay. Yes, I'm probably going to jump on to some of the answers of things that Harmony Phoenix has already spoken about. So primarily that penetration is the most pleasurable aspect of sex, which then kind of, I think even just thinking about it from sex ed, I'm not sure if everyone had that kind of opportunity. It's very, very biological. It's the insertion of a penis into a vagina, and the end of sex, like Harmony Phoenix mentioned, is ejaculation. And I think, unfortunately, then that's where like the orgasm gap comes into play. If I'm correct, I think cis hetero men, I think, tend to reach climax. I think it's 95%, whereas women tend to, I think the percentage is about 65%, and it's slightly higher within the lesbian community, about 86%, but even still, it's not up to par with heterosexual men. And I think this idea of exploring sex outside penetration is really important, because I also think it puts a lot of pressure on people to kind of reach climax rather than kind of enjoy the things that lead up to it. Well, even if it doesn't lead up to it, or it makes you feel as though there's something you're doing wrong if you haven't managed to make your partner reach climax. And I think that's a really big one. I'm also noticing, but it's getting better, that masturbation is still a topic that is slightly taboo. There's this idea that women don't or shouldn't masturbate, that it is wrong to masturbate. I'm talking obviously from a perspective of an African woman. Thankfully, I've had experience living in all sorts of corners of the world, but I do remember kind of moving to like the UK, and I think that's only when I started to feel comfortable with exploring my body in that way, because I wasn't raised to believe that that kind of exploration of myself was good or okay. And of course, that was influenced by religion, family members, and like the society I lived in. But it's great to see that more women are comfortable exploring that, are less afraid of perhaps becoming a lot less sensitive or not being able to enjoy sex with a partner as a result of masturbation. But I think those would be the two that I would want to talk about most, or like I would say they're the biggest ones that I could bring up right now. Yeah.
Yeah, so many people, when you take penetration out of it, they're like, now what?
Yeah,
And
what's sex?
It's just You're like, really? That's all you got? Okay. So we're gonna jump to Kat, and I want to know, what can we learn about pleasure from sex workers?
Well, everybody already touched on some really good points, like that comes into sex work in general. I think when people take what pleasure means to them and they apply it, that is a opening point for you to have the ultimate pleasure that you can have. Like, for example, like when we're talking about cis het people in general, right? Everything's about penetration. And because sex work and porn particularly is a fantasy, people take that and they take it into their personal spaces instead of connecting and finding their own pleasure points. And that's not everything you see on there is scripted, is fantasy, is strictly for the exploration of your mind and exploration of your pleasure. So for sex work, I would definitely say that the exploration of your pleasure, not even just penetration, isn't the only form of pleasure. Number one, and this is why a lot of people don't ejaculate. A lot of people don't, go into that realm of what they should, because they're limiting themselves by just using penetration as a standpoint. You can explore yourself by, as some people explained already, masturbation. You can explore yourself by foreplay. There's a lot of ways to enjoy pleasure rather than just penetration itself. And sex work itself has definitely taught me that, especially when it comes to solo content creation and having that type of way to explore yourself. It's been the biggest aspect for me, especially in healing from sexual trauma myself and learning my body and my experience on what sexual liberation is and what sexual exploration is.
Do you feel comfortable saying more about that? Because I think that there's this stigmatizing narrative that only ever sees sex work as something that is harmful, something that is just traumatizing, and yet we know so many people across the gender spectrum who go to sex work and actually say, this was the first time I felt like I have healed. This is the first time I have felt like I have been in control of my body. This was the first time I felt sexual pleasure in a positive context. So I would love to talk more about that narrative.
Okay, so my thing is, that's the thing. When people see it, because it's something that we are not really talked about, like people just watch porn, they watch sex work. They don't really think about sex workers as people who are healing through things and who have traumas and who are trying to figure themselves out too. Like there's a lot of times that I didn't really understand certain things until I tried it in the means of sex work. And it helped me in more intimate spaces be able to open myself up and be comfortable with myself. So I think that is very important to understand that though the things that you see on screen in regards to sex work it's a fantasy, So healing through that was for me was learning, looking, what don't I like, setting those boundaries, like there's so much to explore when it comes to sex work and sex workers, that because it's such a taboo topic, like everybody kind of sees sex work as something that you just keep behind doors, and which is okay for some people if that's your term of liberation or how you feel to be intimate. And I think that's another confusion point for people. People think when they see sex work that because you're being intimate, well, they see it as intimacy on camera, that's how it looks for you outside in your personal relationships, but sex work is work. It's a job. It's not, all of us use our bodies to do different things. It's just in the terms of sex work, it's a different aspect of how you're using your body. And as well as thinking as it's not even just penetration in regards to sex work. There's different forms, which we're going to get into later in the sense of kink, but there's different forms of how you even experience pleasure throughout sex work. And I think the later questions that you will ask will definitely touch on to that too. Did I answer your question well, or do you need a little bit more?
You're amazing. This is a question that just came to my mind and is for everybody, but I'm thinking about those like viral tweets where someone will say something like, I don't kiss people I don't love. And then someone will attack them and say something like, how are you having sex and you don't want to kiss a person? And for me, I stopped having that type of reaction to people when I thought about the fact that, especially for survivors specifically, we have different relationships to different acts of intimacy. Different things mean something different to us. And so when we get into this idea that because I engage in sex with you, I am consenting to all all things, or everything means the same. I would love for someone to kind of touch on like why that's actually a violent thing, but then also sit with the fact that you have people who are kind of considered undesirable and they're being engaged for sex, but they're having experiences of like no one wants to kiss them, or we have this violent language when it comes to sex, like this is that, back shots only for someone that looks like you, like we perform very political understandings about folks' identities in sex, and I would love to talk about that.
Yes.
So anybody can start.
Bria, I think it's like you touched it, right? Everything is political, including our attraction, right? This might ruffle feathers, but it's fine. I say it all the time. Nobody, in the way I live, nobody is straight. Everybody is queer. And I say that because you don't know anybody's gender unless they tell you. People are attracted to presentation, which doesn't always equal their gender identity, right? And that attraction is rooted in colonialization, it's rooted in anti-blackness, it's rooted in fat phobia, it's rooted in queer phobia, it's rooted in misogyny, it's rooted in all of those things. So we talk about, you know, the piece about like people who are considered undesirable in the world that we live in. Those are all applications of those systems that I just named, right? And so that's where you get the same treatment that these folks like, and Deshaun Harris is a brilliant person, and challenges us to think about like beauty as a currency. And so we engage with people based on our attraction differently than people that we aren't attracted to. And so that also falls into sex. And then the piece that you said about people assume that because you're having sex with someone that you then consent to all these other things. That's because people don't understand consent. Just because I'm consenting to this one thing doesn't mean that I gave you access to me in any other different way. If I said that, okay, I want to do this one thing with you, that don't mean you can blow my phone up and think that you're going to have access to my personal time and we're going to cuddle and all of those things. That's not what I consented to. So I think along with that, people are not having conversations about sex, before sex, after sex, during sex. They're not having those conversations because, again, like I said, like sex is an idea for people. It's that fantasy, like Kat was talking about. And they think that because we're doing this thing that all of these things are greenlit, and that's just not the case. And that goes against consent. Like you have to get consent at every step of the way. And if you want intimacy, say that you want intimacy. If you want sex, say that you want sex. Say what you want and then give the person the opportunity to consent or not to it.
Love that. Does anybody else want to add?
I'll jump in for that. What you were saying is 100% true, and that goes back into the sex worker aspects of like sexual pleasure. It's about that exploration, and with sex work it comes consent. Everything's about consent. Everything's about engaging in conversation. Everything's about, do you like this? You know, communication is key when it comes to that type of thing. So just because you want to do something, you have to be able to understand each other's boundaries to know, is this what this person wants from me? Let me communicate that to you. And if that's something that turns you off to ask if something's okay, then you have no business being with that person, because consent shouldn't be a turnoff at all. If you can't ask and engage in that way and say, hey, do you want this? Do you want that? No, you should not be doing that with that person. So you touched in so many points already. I'm really enjoying this because that goes, I think people have that idea, especially when it comes to sex work, that they see all these things and they just think that like it's just happening, like there was not a conversation to have before you're doing these things. It's like, you know.
Yes.
I think
go ahead.
I think toward both points that you all made, Harmony Phoenix and Kat, is this piece about communication, and something that when I was developing like sexual health curriculum at Spelman, there was a lot that needed to be discussed about consent. Like consent was actually not in the sexual health curriculum at all. Like there was not even one word around consent. And so putting that in there was also about really opening people up for the first time to really being vulnerable. And I think that because we don't live in a culture that cares for vulnerability, cultivates vulnerability, allows for us to have that, it can be hard to even get to consent, because consent requires for you to, like you all said, communicate. It requires you to know your body, to kind of know what your boundaries are, to be able to feel that you can advocate for that. So there's like an environment of safety that has to happen. There's also a level of vulnerability with oneself that has to be there. So like when and where are people, especially young folks, young Black people, being able to say like, oh, I'm going to be intimate and vulnerable with myself. Like, where is that happening? How is that being cultivated, and where? And so because that often is just missing altogether, you get people who are just kind of like running into each other, having no idea how to even begin that conversation. And it gets very frustrating. You see it on Twitter, you see it in all these different spaces. On top of the fact that we do have a culture of domination and coercion and violence. And so you have that going, and that then further diminishes people's capacities for the vulnerability required to even arrive at consent. So I think that thinking through how do you create the safety measures for vulnerability is really important, and understanding that it's like a collective undertaking. It's not something that can be done at the individual level. And it will require more than one person. It will require more than just a few couples. It's definitely a cultural shift.
Yes, that's so important. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to quickly add as well. I do think there needs to be a shifting of narrative from consent is unsexy to consent is very sexy. I think even just looking at TV, watching movies, there's this idea that as soon as maybe the couple you're watching on TV starts to make out, it's all games go. You know, we're just gonna go all the way to the end of whatever the end is. And I think even just kind of talking to people in my own research, um, there's no, people are uncomfortable having those types of conversations. People have a tendency to assume that um, just because we've said, or just because we're at my house, that means we are now going to, you know, have sex or engage in some sort of sexual activity. And I think, similar to what everyone has touched on already, there needs to be a sense of, well, one, I think people need to release shame a little bit. I think with vulnerability comes shame. Or I think I mean it the other way around. Apologies, but there's something there that needs to be a little more open. Like people need to be a little bit more open about what consent is and how maybe they aren't ready to do things sometimes, or how people can change their minds. But yeah, it was just to kind of add on because everyone had mentioned essentially everything I was going to say. Yeah.
You all for answering my spontaneous question. Y'all did so well. I know that wasn't on the run of show. But, my next question is for Harmony Phoenix, and I would love to know how does a person's spiritual connection play a role in their connection to pleasure? So basically, I would just love like what in your spiritual work is connected to folks' just pleasure, because we don't really talk about that as often, like spirituality and sexual pleasure.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about how to say this. So, and I'll speak for myself, right? Through my spiritual journey, I've been a forward-facing spiritualist, meaning I've been doing spiritual work for community and not just myself and family and things like that for 11 years now. And throughout my journey of my continuing journey of learning myself and understanding who I am as a person, and the deep shadow work that I've been doing and getting to know and healing my traumas, I began to realize that, like, oh, it's not that I don't like this thing, it's that this thing happened to me when this thing happened to me. So I associate this thing with trauma, or I associate this thing with this kind of person or this type of situation. And being able to separate those things, and it comes with a lot of healing work that you have to do with yourself. And it's a continuous process that you go through when you are tackling like realizing and understanding your traumas, because the first step is actually realizing like, oh, I'm traumatized. That is a very hard thing, because it, again, like what Sierra was saying with the vulnerability, like it's a very vulnerable thing to understand that, oh, I've been traumatized, because then that means that somebody has taken power from me. That means that I've been victimized in a particular type of way. And that's a hard thing to understand, because in this world tells you that when bad things happen to you, it's your fault. And so when you're interrogating those traumas, right, and you begin to separate that, like, okay, this thing happened, but that doesn't mean that that is one, that's not what's supposed to happen. And this thing won't happen to me all the time. And this was that situation where this person decided that that their wants was more important to my right to my body. And your spiritual practice can help you reclaim that power and understand that it is yours. It is yours. You have the right to say no. You have the right to say yes. You have the right to say not quite like that. You have the right to say not right here, not right now. You have the right to say all of those things. And for me, like doing my ancestral work, I come from a long line of powerful ancestral beings. And so if I believe that my people are powerful, then I have to believe that I'm powerful because I'm here because they were. And so that means that nobody has the right to take away my power. And if they do that, if that does happen, it's not of any fault of mine. That's a choice that they made. So any choices that I make in regards to my pleasure belongs to me and only me, and other people not honoring that has nothing to do with me. And so I hope that answered the question.
It did. Thank you. That was a wonderful answer. We're gonna go. I'm gonna pivot back to Sierra, and I cannot remember if you tackled this already, but did we talk about how anti-blackness affects understandings of Black pleasure? Did we go there?
We didn't, but I'm so happy to go there because we kind of like, you know, everyone has kind of touched on the parameters of what makes anti-blackness already. Like we've talked about some of it. I think Rosa was talking earlier about all the ways that colonialism and colonial elements and ideas, like how we navigate our bodies and think of sex. That is one way that anti-blackness shows up. The way that we've talked about cis heteronormativity, big word for saying like people assume that folks are cis, people assume that people are heterosexual, and in that assumption make very narrow ways for us to live out our lives, right? Like that's anti-blackness because who we are as Black folks does not fit into that and will never fit into that. And so in terms of like us coming into our pleasure, anything that we do, frankly, and a lot of people are really confused about this, but it's true. Anything that we do within our pleasure, within our bodies, is going to be queer, is going to be left of center, is not going to be correct, is going to be deemed wrong, you know? And so like all Black sexuality is going to be understood in an anti-Black way because we are in an anti-Black world. And so one thing that I really think that has been important for me in my survival is to really do what Harmony Phoenix was just talking about, is kind of going into those places that are really shadowy based on sexual trauma and like decoupling some things. And for me as a queer person, it was like, I liked some of the stuff I was doing when I was a kid with girls, but I had a lot of shame because I already knew that I was not supposed to be doing that, right? Like that was the idea. But as we get older and we come to understand more about who we are, it's like actually who says that? Who dictates what's wrong and what is? And so I think that like anti-Blackness really does get us into a space where we have to look at who is determining what our pleasure is, what is determining that. And that is a conversation that is really challenging. And so when it comes to thinking about like anti-Blackness, it's a daily, lifelong journey because we are in, it's literally the air that we breathe. Like it is every single thing that is barring us from the lives, the living out a full life. Being able to have housing, it permeates every element of our lives, to the point that there are people who do argue that we live a social death, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to do a task and answer into the, you know, how does anti-Blackness affect it? That anti-Blackness is the reason that pleasure is so complicated in the first place, in the sense of we're not going to be able to talk about pleasure without talking about violence. That is offensive, anti-Blackness. The very way that we come into pleasure or come into knowing our bodies, come into knowing sex, a lot of us is through anti-Black violence. And so these conversations really, it's not, to me, there is no like anti-Blackness and then pleasure. They're like all at once happening at the same time, and does make the conversation very fraught, but it does not, for me, make it completely foreclosed. Like I think pleasure is still absolutely possible. And so how do we create that possibility? How do we make that possible? For me, I just take up a lot of questions, and that comes up in journaling, that comes up in doing self portraits and being able to take on perceiving myself for myself and taking myself into consideration outside of the ways that anti-blackness is thinking of and deeming my sexuality and my body and my being, and doing that in community with other people who are like doing what Toni Morrison talks about, where she says, I took the center and I took the margins and I put it at the very core of my life. Doing that kind of work is really going to set up, I think, a way, an impossible way of having pleasure in this world. It's not an easy thing, and it's definitely something that's daily. And sometimes even moment by moment. And I think that where and how those little moments of joy kind of connect is how you're going to end up with, I think, a life fulfilled with pleasure.
I love that. And I love how you name specific things that you had to do to get there. I think in my own journey, I had to learn how to get comfortable in my body, right? Like sex was not possible, or at least not pleasurable sex, until I felt like I was actually in my body, right? Not just floating and just letting the experience happen and just being like, okay, finally that's over. Like, what does it mean to be in your body? And the only way I was able to do that was to explore yoga. Yoga really helped with that. Like, how do you feel different parts of your body? Like, this is here. I have friends who literally had to like start having sex in front of mirrors. They needed to see themselves and like see what they look like in that practice, or they started like recording on purpose, like to get in their bodies, to be like, oh, I'm doing this. This is happening with me, not to me, but with me. And there are things that I can actually do with my body that feel good. And I wish that that's the messages that like Black children got, as opposed to not just Black children don't just get abstinence only education, but they get like all the stigma, all the misogynoir,
Yeah.
all of like the queer shame, like all of that wrapped up in one. Like when
Disabilities and everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I think about the fact that my mother had me when she was 17, I have to think about the fact that all the messages I got growing up were do not have sex and be like your mom. So how
Yes.
do you get to a positive place of pleasure when from your birth, everyone has been telling you don't be like your mother, right? When all your mother did was have sex. You know what I'm saying? So I just think about those messages and how deep they run. And like that messaging was a violent attempt to protect me from the stigma of young Black motherhood, young Black parenting, right? But it was still violent. Even if you're trying to protect me from anti-Blackness, if you do it in violent ways, that's still anti-Blackness. And I just,
Leading into anti-blackness.
okay, you know?
Yeah.
So I think the question of sexual pleasure is so complicated for Black people because of everything that you but we're gonna switch gears a little bit, and I'm gonna ask Kat, what is kink? Can you give us a full rundown? What is that?
King goes back into the idea of pleasure. Number one, it's about that whole aspect I was talking about in the sense of fantasy. And a lot of times people think about kink, think about BDSM, right? Um, and BDSM is basically a kink based thing that a lot of people do, whether you're a sex worker or not. You don't have to be a sex worker to participate in BDSM or kink in general. Kink isn't just for sex workers, but kink is basically the exploration of your body and the exploration of your, it could be exploration of your sexualities, the exploration of yourself in general. So when I think about kink, I think about where's my mind and my body going to go with doing these things? Like, how can I find the ultimate pleasure from doing these things? And as you guys were just saying before, it ties into that of looking at yourself, being involved with yourself, figuring yourself out. That is the whole rundown, I feel like, of what kink is in the simplistic term, I would say.
Mm. And then so my next question is for everyone. But how do we navigate kinks that are highly stigmatized? And quite frankly, when is it okay to kink shame? Because I'm gonna keep it real. Mama don't support race play in no context. That's a question for everybody.
You know, the thing that I learned about kink for me has been healing in a lot of ways. Like, I think for some things, there's definitely like a line to draw to it, especially when it comes to that type of stuff. There are some people I know who feel like they have to participate in that type of thing, and it's a really layered conversation on not trying to police how people are healing through things or why they're doing these things. But the whole thing is like the fetishization of it and how it's being marketed, if anything. You know what I mean? Like, kinks don't always have to be a public thing, though there are some people who have kinks that involve public things, right? And I think that goes with people understanding consent. Like, everybody does not consent to whatever kinks that you have. So just because we can use your example, just because you may have a race play kink doesn't mean that everybody wants to be exposed to your kink. So I think that's where people are not respecting people's ideas of that. You can have whatever kinks you want, just as long as you are not praying that onto other people and making it seem like it has to be a monolithic thing. That is my issue right there. It's like, whatever you need to do to heal yourself, to pleasure yourself, that is completely up to you and your space or your partner's spaces. But when you bring that outside of that and you're not respecting other people's boundaries, that's not okay. And that's where I feel like the ideal of kink shaming does come in. When you're not respecting other people's boundaries, you're not consenting or involving other people to consent to the things that you're into. That to me is kink shaming. The lack of consent is kink shaming to me.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
I just want to also name, like, I love that answer, right? Because anybody can have whatever. It's a couple of ones that I also am like, and race play is one of those. Like, I don't know, ain't for me. That's what I'm saying. And I absolutely believe that, like, it's the consent piece of it, right? Like, how are you exposing other people without their consent? That I feel like is the line. But also, nobody, if somebody cannot consent, then that's not kink. That is abuse. I just want to name that. If a person cannot consent,
yes.
If a person cannot consent, that is, it's not a kink, it's abuse. And also, like, in healthy kink dynamics, there's always an ongoing conversation about what is okay and what is not okay. And so, like, I'm also going to say 50 Shades of Grey, that was horrible. It was horrible for everybody that saw it because they had this one idea of what kink was. And actually, Christian Grey was an abuser throughout the entire book. He stalked that girl. Let's talk about it. And so people see, like, these versions, again, because it's the fantasy, right? Like, they see these things and they think that that's how it happens. No, in that type of situation, Anna should have been the one in control. When you are in a situation where there's a dominant person, a submissive person, this is one type of kink. The submissive person is the one that has all of the control. It looks like the dominant person is the one that's in control, but that dominant person should not be doing anything that the submissive person did not already agree to, and is also checking in consistently about what they consent about. And so, again, we go back to the root of everything is consent. You can have whatever kink that you want as long as everybody is consenting. If somebody is underage, they cannot consent. So therefore, that is abuse. It's not a kink. But if you're with someone and they like degradation or they like being talked to, however, that's between y'all. You understand what I'm saying? Like, that's between y'all. And it, again, like, the root of it is just consent. And that, and as far as kink shaming, hey, it's a couple of them that I'm just like, ain't for me. Do what you got to do, but don't expose me to it.
I think I asked this question because I think that there's a whole like different body of work that's interested in, is it possible that the things we enact in the bedroom come outside of the bedroom and cause harm? And so I think when we get into things of like race play, can you just act things out in the bedroom and it stay there? I think becomes the question, or does it seep out? And I think that was the point of tension for lots of people. Are you only expressing that particular type of kink in the bedroom because of how you want to treat people outside of the bedroom, and does it reinforce larger problems? But I feel like now we getting real academic.
Wait, you know what you just, oh, go ahead, you want to go, Hermie?
Sorry, I just wanted to say this one thing. Like, kink is not just sexual. Kink is not just
right.
There are a lot of kinks that are lifestyle kinks. I just wanted to name that.
Yeah, right.
What I was going to say is what you said is true, especially in the sense of unlearning anti-blackness itself. You know, so if you're participating with somebody who is outside of the space, because at the end of the day, right now, the world that we live in a very microaggressive world when it comes to anti-blackness. There's ways that people can hide their anti-blackness with sexual things and in the world itself in general. So you won't really see these type of things in people even outside of the bedroom, because whiteness is so used to people hiding the ideal of anti-blackness in general, especially when it comes to sexual pleasure. So for some kinks, I do think that if there's a communication and conversation, and you're also being honest and true with yourself and the people that you're participating in, I don't think those things can seep outside of the bedroom if you are understanding boundaries and communication, and it goes back to that consent aspect of it. But when it comes to something like that, I think that's something that's so rooted into our community and to ourselves in general, that how are you going to get that out from not being together? You know, like there's some things, it's like, for example, when people say things like you can separate the art from the artist, it's like some things you cannot do that with. You just cannot. They're rooted together. They're deeply rooted together. Like even in the sense of how ableism may come into certain kinks for people, you know, or do you think about desirability politics that come into certain kinks, or featureism that comes into certain kinks? All these type of things and aspects are important when you're naming kinks, and how you engaging with them, and how you're engaging with the people who think that they're okay, or how those people are navigating those spaces to other people. So I don't think that in a lot of spaces, and especially when it comes to healing from sexual trauma, we talk about the desirability politics of things. We talk about ableism, but behind healing through sexual trauma. I think that was a big thing for me in regards to sex work, with being not having a visible disability and having to learn how to heal through my own issues that I have, you know? So
I love that. Thank you for that. I want to pivot us to a lighter question and just ask, what are the best sex toys on the market, y'all? What do we need? What should we buy after this?
Unbound Babes.
Yes.
Everybody should know Unbound Babes. But I would say whatever you get the Jolt Jelly with it, and then also warming CBD lube.
Oh, wow.
Is important.
Specific.
CBD lube. I never thought about that. Okay.
Warming CBD lube for any and all kind of toys. Penetrative toys are, even more fun with that. There's a couple, I have to look and see what the brands are, but they're out there and they're good. Also, for everybody who may not know a lot about lubes, water-based.
Yes.
Water-based.
Always 100%. Yeah.
And the Unbound Babes puff is really fun. And that's what I'll put in for that.
Any other recommendations?
Well, I can obviously only speak for myself, and also it depends very much on kind of what you enjoy.
Yes.
I prefer clitoral stimulation, so anything that involves that area, I don't necessarily need penetration. It's called the womanizer. Don't love the name, but absolutely love the toy. Would recommend. And I think there's a rose. What is it called? A rose?
The rose.
I yeah, like
rose.
Yeah, it's great. It's simple. And also, like, depending on if you have a partner and that's kind of what you're into, you can always get one of those remote controlled ones. So kind of they are in control of kind of your pleasure in that sense. But those would be my top recommendations. But again, speaking from things kind of I enjoy.
Yes, Rosa, yeah, do that. There's this app, and it you get the app and the toy, and it's called Vibes, and it's like a Bluetooth thing, and it works for miles and miles and miles. So
taking notes.
Take away. They can be right there involved with you. That's all I have.
Yeah, I think all of what you guys said are very good toys. I definitely like what Rosa was saying. I think it also depends on what you're into, what you're trying to do. There's things in the sense of when you think about if you want to just do something, if you want to do something ejaculation wise, then there's toys for that. There's the rose, which is very good. There's a different brands that use the same type of like, I guess, like ideal of what a toy is, but also I think I think that it's just a very layered thing because I have a lot of toys. That's why I'm just like, wait, which one is like my ultimate favorite? I think my mood changes so much on what I want to do that I'm just like, all right, do I want stimulation, or do I want penetration, or do I want something anal based, or do I want something in regards of the different type of body parts that I have? Like, how do I want to elevate those things to make myself feel the pleasure that I want to? Like you guys said, there's like everyone said, there's these toys that you can use from miles away. Those are really those are they're nice. And yeah,
they do work miles and miles away. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Noted.
Go ahead, Sierra.
I was going to add, kind of in conjunction with the last question and this one with kink, is allowing yourself to have permission, like when you're alone. Just like toys don't necessarily have to be genitalia based. Like you also can have like French whips are fun, things like that, like things that just kind of get the sensation going in your body. Don't sleep on those.
There are pressure points that will help you.
Yes. Chokers, things like that, like just accessories, like if you just want to get into just the beginning of a sensation, things like that.
Buy yourself a scalp massager and see how that helps you.
Like pleasure comes from starting with that feeling of you having that sensation is it doesn't even, like you said, the choker is actually a really good starting point to have that type of like closeness to yourself. I wear chokers all the time. Like I was like, do I wear one today? I don't think I'm gonna do that today, but usually I wear chokers all the time because it's that closeness, that intimacy of something against your skin is another point to start your idea of healing through pleasure itself. It can be clothes sometimes too. Like just something tight on your skin is another way to help. For me, has been a way to help heal through sexual trauma myself, is having that feeling of touch on my skin and even baths and massaging yourself and doing that type of thing. Like relearning your body is important when it comes to sexual healing and healing from sexual trauma. Like relearning your body is a very important aspect of that.
Yeah,
I agree. Just romancing yourself. Take a shower, light some candles, play whatever music makes you feel sexy, even if it's just you on your own. Actually, there's a yoga. I follow a yoga instructor on YouTube, and she does like date night yoga or like in the like sexy time yoga, which is it's different. Yeah, like it's a different way of exploring your body that isn't necessarily just let me masturbate or let me have sex. Like, there's so
Yeah.
many ways to do that, and I think that's important.
And aroma and sonically, like there's so many ways that we come to arousal. You can have a scent that gets you there. You can
All
have,
your senses are important.
it's all important. But we are at time, so I just wanted to say thank you to all 4 of you for joining. I think I followed 3 of you, and I, so much just admiration and just respect for the work that you do in your fields. And just thank you to all 4 of you for doing this and to come and talk about pleasure. Our winners for the necklace vibrators are Stefani Carter, Ella, I hope I said that right, Kiara Imani, and Naja Ross. So if you all could just email the MSK email, msk@bwhi.org, and we will make sure we get you your free vibrator necklaces for being here today. But again, thank you all so much. I hope one day we could do this again because it's so much more to explore when we talk about Black pleasure.
Yeah, hours not enough. It's not.
Bye.
I feel like for each section we need a different panel.
This is amazing. Thank you so much.